The dust-filled air of the Wyoming Territory seemed to suffocate Ruth Calloway's very soul as she stumbled along the desolate trail. Her once fine boots now scuffed beyond recognition, her dress torn at the hem from miles of desperate walking. 3 days earlier, she had stood before her father and the town elders of Prairie Ridge, refusing the hand of Judge Harmon, a man 30 years her senior with a reputation that made her skin crawl, only to find herself cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever she could carry in a single carpetbag. The year was 1878, and a woman without family or husband in the western frontier might as well be invisible. At 22, Ruth had known the consequences of her defiance would be severe, but nothing had prepared her for the swift and merciless judgment. "No daughter of mine rejects a respectable match," her father had declared, his face twisted with rage that masked his embarrassment before the town's most influential men. "You'll either marry Judge Harmon by Sunday or find yourself with no home and no name to speak of." Ruth had chosen the latter, pride and dignity driving her forward even as fear threatened to consume her with each passing mile. The unforgiving June sun beat down on her uncovered head, her bonnet long since sacrificed as a water carrier when her canteen ran dry the previous afternoon. She stumbled, her vision swimming with black spots, and barely registered the sound of approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Instinctively, Ruth ducked off the trail, seeking shelter behind a cluster of sage brush. A woman alone on these trails was vulnerable to dangers far worse than thirst or hunger. "Whoa there, thunder," a deep voice called out, and Ruth peered through the brush to see a man astride a magnificent black stallion come to a halt on the trail. He wore a worn leather vest over a chambray shirt, his hat pulled low against the sun, and a lariat hung from his saddle horn. A cowboy, perhaps from one of the nearby ranches that dotted this part of the territory. "I can see you behind those bushes, madam," he called out, not unkindly. "I mean you no harm. Ain't proper for a lady to be walking these parts alone." Ruth hesitated, her throat too parched to respond even if she wished to. The man dismounted, keeping a respectful distance, and removed his hat. His face came into full view, tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the open sky. His eyes were a striking shade of blue that reminded Ruth of the summer sky after a thunderstorm, and his hair, the color of wheat, fell in waves around his face. "Name's Ethan Sutton," he said, reaching slowly for the canteen hanging from his saddle. "Ranch hand at the Broken Spoke, few miles west of here." He extended the canteen toward her. Water, the word alone was enough to draw Ruth from her hiding place. She emerged shakily, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. "You look like you've been walking a fair piece," Ethan observed, his eyes taking in her disheveled appearance with concern rather than judgment. "Heading somewhere particular?" Ruth accepted the canteen with trembling hands, trying to sip slowly despite her desperate thirst. After a moment, she found her voice, hoarse as it was. "Away," she managed. "Just away." Ethan nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mind my asking what you're running from?" "Not running," Ruth corrected, a spark of defiance flashing through her exhaustion. "I refused to marry Judge Harmon of Prairie Ridge. My father gave me an ultimatum. I made my choice." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, respect, perhaps, or understanding. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, "You made the right choice." 4 simple words, yet they washed over Ruth like a cooling rain after months of drought. She had not realized until that moment how desperately she needed to hear that anyone believed she had done the right thing. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Ruth shook her head. "I have an aunt in Denver, but—" She gestured helplessly at her current condition, the miles between here and Colorado seemingly insurmountable. Ethan looked thoughtful, then glanced at the sky. "Sun'll be setting soon. Buffalo's about 8 miles north. There's a boarding house there run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway. She's good people." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I can take you there if you'd allow it." Ruth hesitated, years of caution warring with her desperate situation. But there was something in Ethan Sutton's steady gaze that spoke of honesty, something she'd seen precious little of in Prairie Ridge. "I'd be much obliged," she finally said, her voice steadier than before. Ethan nodded once, then gestured to his horse. "Thunder here is strong enough to carry us both. I'll walk alongside if it makes you more comfortable." "No," Ruth said quickly. "I've imposed enough. I can ride behind if your horse will bear it." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "He's carried heavier loads. Come on then." He helped her mount, his hands respectful as he steadied her. Ruth settled behind the saddle, uncertain where to place her hands until Ethan said, "You'll want to hold on, madam. Trail gets rough in places." Hesitantly, she placed her hands at his sides, maintaining as much distance as the arrangement would allow. Ethan clicked his tongue, and Thunder began moving at a gentle pace. "You have a name, madam?" Ethan asked after they'd traveled in silence for a while. "Ruth," she replied. "Ruth Calloway." "Well, Miss Calloway," he said, "welcome to Wyoming Territory. It ain't always kind, but it's a place where folks can start fresh if they've a mind to." As they rode toward Buffalo, Ruth felt something unfamiliar stir within her chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps her story wasn't ending, but just beginning. Buffalo, Wyoming was hardly more than a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the main road when Ethan and Ruth rode in as dusk was settling. The town had sprung up to serve the needs of the nearby ranches and as a stopover for travelers heading north to Montana Territory. A general store, a smithy, a small church, 2 saloons, and a handful of other establishments lined the dusty main street. Ethan guided Thunder toward a 2-story clapboard house set slightly apart from the more boisterous establishments. A sign hanging from the front porch read "Holloway Boarding House," its letters faded but still legible in the waning light. "Mrs. Holloway's fare with her rates," Ethan said as he helped Ruth dismount. Her legs nearly buckled after the hours on horseback, and he steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "And she doesn't ask too many questions." Ruth clutched her carpet bag to her chest, suddenly acutely aware of her appearance. Her dress, once a respectable blue cotton, was now dusty and stained from her journey. Her hair, which she had always taken pride in, hung in limp strands around her face. "I don't know if I can afford," she began. "Let me speak with her," Ethan interrupted gently. "Mrs. Holloway sometimes needs help with chores. Might be she'd consider a trade until you get settled." Ruth wanted to object. She'd had enough charity for one day, but practicality won out over pride. She nodded her agreement, and they approached the front door together. Mrs. Holloway proved to be a stout woman in her 50s with keen eyes that seemed to take in Ruth's situation at a glance. After Ethan made the introductions and explained in the vaguest terms that Ruth was in need of lodging, the older woman's expression softened. "I've got a room at the back," she said, addressing Ruth directly. "It's small, but it's clean. Ethan says you might be willing to help around the place." "Yes, madam," Ruth replied, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "Good. I need someone to help with the washing and the cooking. Do that, and you can stay for a week while we sort out more permanent arrangements." Relief washed over Ruth so strongly she feared her knees might give way. "Thank you, I'm very grateful." "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Holloway said with a wry smile. "Wait until you've seen the pile of linens that needs washing." She turned to Ethan. "Will you be staying for supper, Mr. Sutton?" "I've got stew on the stove." Ethan shook his head. "Much as I'd like to, madam, I need to get back to the ranch. Boss expects all hands accounted for at night check." Mrs. Holloway nodded and retreated inside, leaving Ruth and Ethan standing on the porch in the gathering twilight. "I don't know how to thank you," Ruth said, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time since he'd found her on the trail. "No need for thanks," Ethan replied, replacing his hat. "Any decent man would have done the same." Ruth thought of Judge Harmon, of her father and the town elders, and wasn't so sure about that. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful." Ethan nodded, then hesitated. "The Broken Spoke's about 5 miles west of town, if you need anything." He trailed off, as if uncertain how to finish the offer. "Thank you," Ruth said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words. With a tip of his hat, Ethan mounted Thunder and rode away, disappearing into the growing darkness. Ruth watched until she could no longer see him, then turned to enter the boarding house, her new temporary home. The room Mrs. Holloway showed her to was indeed small, with just enough space for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for her clothes. But it was clean, as promised, and the window overlooked a small vegetable garden rather than the street, a private corner that felt like a luxury after days of exposure on the open road. "Wash up and come down for supper," Mrs. Holloway instructed. "You look like you could use a good meal." Left alone, Ruth poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed her face and hands, wishing she could wash away the past week as easily as the trail dust. She did her best to smooth her hair and straighten her dress, then made her way downstairs to the dining room. 3 men, commercial travelers by the look of them, were already seated at the long table, along with a young woman who couldn't have been more than 18 or 19. They all looked up when Ruth entered, but quickly returned to their meals after nodding politely. Mrs. Holloway appeared from the kitchen carrying a bowl of stew, which she placed before Ruth. "Eat," she said simply. The stew was rich with chunks of beef and vegetables, and Ruth had to force herself not to devour it too quickly. As she ate, she listened to the quiet conversation around the table, gleaning that the men were indeed traveling salesmen, while the young woman, Clara, worked as a shop assistant at the general store. After dinner, Mrs. Holloway showed Ruth to the kitchen and explained what would be expected of her, rising early to help prepare breakfast for the boarders, assisting with the washing on Mondays, and general cleaning throughout the week. The work would be hard, but Ruth was no stranger to domestic duties, and the prospect of a roof over her head and regular meals made it more than fair exchange. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Ruth found her thoughts returning to Ethan Sutton. There had been something in his eyes when she told him about refusing Judge Harmon, a flash of something that went beyond mere approval. Recognition, perhaps. She wondered what his story might be, what had brought him to Wyoming and the Broken Spoke Ranch. But such thoughts were a luxury she couldn't afford. Ruth needed to focus on survival now, on building a new life from the ashes of the old. As she drifted toward sleep, she pushed away thoughts of the handsome cowboy and tried to concentrate on the tasks that awaited her tomorrow. Morning came too soon, with Mrs. Holloway knocking briskly at her door before the sun had fully risen. Ruth dressed quickly in the same travel-worn dress and made her way to the kitchen, where she was put to work kneading dough for biscuits, while Mrs. Holloway prepared eggs and bacon. "You'll need more clothes if you're staying," the older woman observed, eyeing Ruth's dress. "Clara might have something that would fit you. She's about your size." "I couldn't impose," Ruth began. "Not imposing if you pay her for them," Mrs. Holloway interrupted practically. "She's always buying new things when the peddlers come through. I'm sure she'd part with some of her older dresses for a fair price." Ruth thought of the meager funds hidden in her carpet bag, barely enough to get her to Denver, let alone establish herself there. "I don't have much money," she admitted. Mrs. Holloway shrugged. "Talk to her anyway. Maybe you can work something out." The day passed in a blur of chores, serving breakfast, clearing away dishes, sweeping floors, and helping Mrs. Holloway prepare vegetables for the evening meal. By mid-afternoon, Ruth's back ached from the unaccustomed labor, but there was satisfaction in the work, in seeing immediate results from her efforts. She was hanging laundry in the back garden when she heard a familiar voice from the front of the house. Pausing, a damp sheet in her hands, Ruth listened as Ethan Sutton spoke with Mrs. Holloway. "Just wanted to make sure Miss Calloway settled in all right," he was saying, his voice carrying through the open window. "She's doing fine," came Mrs. Holloway's reply. "Works hard, doesn't complain. Could use some new clothes, though." There was a pause, and Ruth imagined Ethan nodding thoughtfully. "Thought that might be the case. Brought these, my sister left them behind when she moved to California last year, about the same size, I'd reckon." Ruth's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. She quickly finished hanging the sheet, then made her way around to the front of the house. Ethan stood on the porch, hat in hand, a bundle wrapped in brown paper under his arm. He looked up as Ruth appeared, and something in his expression made her heart beat a little faster. "Miss Calloway," he said, nodding politely, "was just passing through town on an errand for the ranch. Thought you might be able to use these." He held out the bundle. Ruth hesitated, pride warring with necessity. "That's very kind, Mr. Sutton, but I couldn't. They're just gathering dust otherwise," he interrupted gently. "My sister would be pleased to know they're being put to good use, Mrs. Holloway, with the practicality that seemed to define her, took the bundle from Ethan and pressed it into Ruth's hands. "Thank the man and accept the gift, child. Pride doesn't keep you warm or decent." Ruth met Ethan's eyes, finding only kindness there, not pity. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm very grateful," he nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Boss gave me some time in town. I'd be happy to show you around a bit if you're not too busy with your chores." Mrs. Holloway waved a hand dismissively. "She's done enough for today. Go on, get some air. Just be back by supper time." Before Ruth could protest, the older woman had disappeared into the house, leaving her alone with Ethan on the porch. "I should put these away first," Ruth said, gesturing with the bundle. "Of course," Ethan agreed. "I'll wait here." In her room, Ruth unwrapped the package to find 3 dresses, one a practical brown cotton for everyday wear, another a prettier blue with white piping, and a third in a soft green that Ruth would never have chosen for herself but found herself admiring. There was also a shawl, a nightgown, and most treasured of all, a fresh set of undergarments. The clothes showed signs of wear but were clean and well mended. Ruth changed quickly into the brown dress, relieved to be free of her travel-stained clothes at last. It fit well enough, a little loose in the waist and snug across the shoulders, but far better than what she'd been wearing. She washed her face and hands, then pinned her hair up as neatly as she could before rejoining Ethan. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, and Ruth felt a flutter of self-consciousness. "Your sister had good taste," she said, smoothing the skirt of the dress. "She always thought so," Ethan replied with a smile. "Shall we?" Buffalo was small enough that a complete tour took less than an hour. Ethan showed Ruth the general store, the post office, the small schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and pointed out which of the 2 saloons was considered respectable enough for a lady to pass by without risking her reputation. "Not much compared to wherever you're from, I expect," he said as they stood in front of the milliner's shop, which also sold fabric and notions. Prairie Ridge wasn't much bigger, Ruth admitted, though it fancied itself quite civilized. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Ethan gave her a sidelong glance. "Some of the most uncivilized behavior I've ever seen came from folks who considered themselves proper society." There was something in his tone that made Ruth wonder again about his past, but before she could ask, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A wagon had pulled up outside the general store, and a man was unloading crates while calling for assistance. "That's Jeremiah Weeks," Ethan explained. "Runs a circuit between here and Sheridan, brings supplies and mail once a month." Ruth watched as several townspeople gathered around the wagon, eager for news and deliveries from outside their small community. "Is that how you get supplies at the ranch?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "That and trips to town. Boss sends someone in once a week for necessities." He hesitated, then added, "I'm usually the one who comes. Could bring you anything you need if you make a list." The offer touched Ruth deeply. "You've already been more than kind, Mr. Sutton." "Ethan," he corrected gently, "and it's no trouble. I'm coming anyway." They continued walking, and Ethan explained more about the area, the ranches that surrounded Buffalo, the seasonal rhythms of cattle raising, the harsh winters and the brief, glorious summers. Ruth found herself fascinated not just by the information, but by the way he spoke about it all, with a quiet passion that revealed his deep connection to this rugged land. "How did you come to work at the Broken Spoke?" she asked as they made their way back toward the boarding house. A shadow crossed Ethan's face briefly. "Needed a fresh start," he said simply. "Boss took a chance on me 5 years ago, been there ever since." Ruth sensed there was more to the story but respected his reticence. After all, she had her own past that she wasn't eager to discuss. As they approached the boarding house, Ethan slowed his pace. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you're looking for work beyond helping her out. Yes, Ruth confirmed. I need to save enough to either establish myself here or move on to Denver. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Doc Reynolds' wife was saying just yesterday that she needs help with their children. They have 4 under the age of 10 and she's expecting another. Might be worth asking there. I'll do that, Ruth said, grateful for the suggestion. Thank you. They had reached the porch of the boarding house and an awkward silence fell between them. Ruth was suddenly acutely aware of how much this man had done for her, a complete stranger in the span of just 2 days. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness, she said finally. Ethan shook his head. No repayment necessary, just... He hesitated, then continued, just remember that what happened in Prairie Ridge doesn't define who you are. Out here, you get to decide that for yourself. The words struck Ruth with unexpected force, addressing a fear she hadn't even fully acknowledged to herself, that in losing her family and home, she had somehow lost her identity as well. I'll try to remember that, she said softly. Ethan smiled, and the warmth of it seemed to reach all the way to his eyes. I should get back to the ranch, but I'll be in town next Tuesday for supplies if you need anything. Tuesday, Ruth repeated, surprised by how much she was already looking forward to seeing him again. With a tip of his hat, Ethan left, and Ruth watched him go, a strange mix of emotions stirring within her. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else, a flutter of possibility that she hadn't dared to feel since leaving Prairie Ridge. The next morning, Ruth made her way to the doctor's home, a neat white house at the edge of town. Mrs. Reynolds, a harried-looking woman with a kind face, greeted her cautiously but warmed considerably when Ruth explained that Ethan Sutton had suggested she inquire about helping with the children. Ethan's word is good enough for me, Mrs. Reynolds declared. Can you start tomorrow? 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 6 days a week, Sundays off for church. The pay was modest but fair, and Ruth accepted immediately. As she walked back to the boarding house, a newfound sense of purpose in her step, she realized that in less than a week her life had been completely transformed. She had employment, a place to stay, and the beginnings of connections in this small community. And she had Ethan Sutton to thank for much of it. The cowboy who had found her at her lowest moment and, instead of taking advantage, had shown her kindness and respect. The man whose simple words, "You made the right choice," had given her the strength to believe in her decision. As the days passed, Ruth settled into a routine. Mornings began early, helping Mrs. Holloway prepare breakfast for the boarders before walking to the Reynolds home. The children, ranging from 2 to 9 years old, were lively but good-natured, and Ruth found unexpected joy in their company. She returned to the boarding house in time to help with dinner preparations, then spent her evenings sewing or reading borrowed books before retiring early, exhausted but satisfied. Each Tuesday, Ethan came to town for supplies. He always found time to stop by the boarding house, sometimes just for a brief greeting, other times staying for a cup of coffee if Mrs. Holloway invited him. Ruth found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. As the weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Ruth learned that Ethan had come to Wyoming after serving briefly in the Army following the war between the states. Though he never spoke directly of his experiences, she gathered that he had seen things that had driven him to seek the solitude of the frontier. In turn, she told him more about her life in Prairie Ridge, her mother's death when she was 16, leaving her to run the household for her father and younger brother. The increasingly desperate attempts by her father to marry her off as his business faltered. And finally, the ultimatum that had led to her exile. Judge Harmon has buried 2 wives already, she explained one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. Both died in childbirth before they reached 30. He has a reputation for. She hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. For cruelty, Ethan finished for her, his voice hard. Men like that are the same everywhere. Yes, Ruth agreed quietly. When my father first suggested the match, I tried to reason with him, but after my brother left for Colorado, father became more insistent, said it was my duty to help secure the family's position. When I refused, She shook her head, the memory still painful. He said I was no daughter of his. Ethan's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that sent warmth spreading up her arm. Some men mistake control for strength, he said. Your father was wrong, Ruth, about Harmon and about you. The use of her first name, the first time he had allowed himself that intimacy, made her heart skip. I know that now, she said, meeting his gaze. I'm starting to know who I really am away from his shadow. Ethan's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. And who is that? Ruth considered the question seriously. Someone stronger than I thought, someone who wants to build a life on her own terms. She paused, then added softly, someone who's grateful that a certain cowboy happened to be riding by at just the right moment. The look in Ethan's eyes made her breath catch, but before he could respond, Mrs. Holloway called from inside that a telegram had arrived for one of the traveling salesmen, and the moment was broken. As summer gave way to autumn, Ruth's position in Buffalo became more established. Mrs. Reynolds, impressed with her competence, increased her wages slightly and began introducing her around town as our dear Miss Calloway. Mrs. Holloway, too, seemed to have accepted her as a permanent fixture, reducing her rent in exchange for continued help with the boarding house. Ruth had saved enough to buy fabric for new dresses, which she sewed in the evenings, and had even begun to put a small amount aside each week toward what she now thought of as her future fund. The exact shape of that future remained uncertain, but for the first time since leaving Prairie Ridge, she allowed herself to believe that she might build a life here in Buffalo. And increasingly, when she imagined that life, Ethan Sutton was part of it. The realization came to her one crisp October evening as she sat darning socks by the fire in the boarding house parlor. Mrs. Holloway had retired early with a headache, and the other boarders were either out or in their rooms. Ruth found herself thinking of the way Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, of how carefully he listened when she spoke, of the quiet strength he radiated without ever making her feel diminished. She was falling in love with him. The thought should have terrified her. After all, she had fled Prairie Ridge to avoid being forced into marriage, had relished her newfound independence. But this feeling, this gentle, growing warmth that filled her when she thought of Ethan, had nothing in common with the cold dread that Judge Harmon's proposal had inspired. This was her choice, her heart freely given, but did Ethan feel the same? He was unfailingly kind, yes, but he was kind to everyone. The occasional touch of his hand on hers, the lingering glances, were they signs of deeper feeling, or merely friendliness from a man who saw her as someone in need of protection? The question tormented Ruth for days afterward, making her distracted at work and causing Mrs. Holloway to ask more than once if she was feeling unwell. By the time Tuesday came around, she had resolved to be more observant, to look for signs of Ethan's true feelings. But when Tuesday evening arrived, it was not Ethan who appeared at the boarding house door, but another ranch hand from the Broken Spoke, a taciturn older man named Frank. Ethan couldn't make it to town today, he explained gruffly when Ruth answered the door. Asked me to let you know he's laid up with a broken arm. Horse threw him during a Mustang roundup on Sunday. Ruth's heart seized with concern. Is he all right otherwise? How bad is the break? Frank shrugged. Doc said it clean, says he'll heal fine if he rests it proper. But he'll be staying at the ranch for a few weeks at least. I see, Ruth said, trying to mask her disappointment and worry. Thank you for letting me know. After Frank left, Ruth paced her small room, trying to decide what to do. The thought of not seeing Ethan for weeks was distressing, but what could she do? The ranch was 5 miles outside of town, and she had no way to get there. The answer came to her the next morning while helping Mrs. Reynolds with the washing. The doctor was preparing to ride out to the Broken Spoke to check on Ethan's arm. I'd like to send something for Mr. Sutton, Ruth said carefully. Perhaps some of Mrs. Holloway's applesauce. I know she just put up a batch. Mrs. Reynolds gave her a knowing look. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. In fact, why don't you come along? The children are visiting their grandmother today, and I could use the company on the ride back. Ruth tried not to appear too eager. If you're sure it wouldn't be an imposition. Not at all, Mrs. Reynolds assured her. Doc says Ethan's been a terrible patient, restless and snappish. A friendly face might do him good. And so that afternoon, Ruth found herself in the Reynolds' buggy, a jar of applesauce and some freshly baked bread carefully packed beside her, heading toward the Broken Spoke Ranch. Her stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation, not only at the prospect of seeing Ethan, but at what her visit might reveal about his feelings for her. The Broken Spoke was larger than Ruth had imagined, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and corrals filled with horses. Ranch hands paused in their work to watch as the buggy approached, and a man Ruth guessed must be the ranch owner came out onto the porch to greet them. "Doc Reynolds," he called, "and who's this you've brought with you?" "Miss Ruth Calloway," the doctor replied as he helped Ruth down from the buggy. "She's looking after our children in town, wanted to check on your patient." The ranch owner, a barrel-chested man with a silver-streaked beard, looked Ruth over appraisingly. "You'd be the young lady Ethan's been fretting about whenever he comes back from town," he said with a directness that made Ruth blush. "He's in the bunkhouse. Frank'll show you." The bunkhouse was a long, low building with bunks lining the walls and a central area with a table and chairs. At this time of day, it was empty except for Ethan, who sat at the table attempting to write a letter one-handed, his left arm secured in a sling across his chest. He looked up at their entrance, his expression shifting from frustration to surprise to something Ruth couldn't quite name, something that made her heart race. "Ruth," he said, half rising before the doctor motioned him back to his seat. "What are you doing here, Mrs.?" "Reynolds was kind enough to let me accompany the doctor," she explained, suddenly self-conscious. "I brought you some applesauce and bread." A smile spread slowly across Ethan's face. "That's mighty kind of you." Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I'll just have a look at that arm, then I'll leave you two to visit while I speak with Mr. Johnson about another matter." The examination was quick, the doctor pronouncing himself satisfied with the healing process before excusing himself, leaving Ruth and Ethan alone in the bunkhouse. "You didn't have to come all this way," Ethan said, though his tone suggested he was pleased that she had. Ruth set the jar and wrapped bread on the table. "When Frank said you were hurt, I was worried." She hesitated, then admitted, "And I missed our Tuesday visits." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. "I missed them too," he said quietly. "Was halfway through writing you a note when you arrived." He gestured to the paper on the table where Ruth could see her name written in a somewhat shaky hand. "How did it happen?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. "Foolishness," Ethan admitted ruefully. "Trying to break a Mustang that wasn't ready to be ridden. He got the better of me." Ruth frowned. "That seems dangerous." "Part of the job," Ethan shrugged, then winced as the movement jarred his arm. "Though I'll admit, I've been thinking lately that I might want something more stable, a place of my own, maybe." There was something in his tone, a hint of a future he was considering, that made Ruth's pulse quicken. "Your own ranch?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Been saving for it." "There's land available north of here, near the Montana border. Good grazing, water rights included." He paused, then added more hesitantly, "It's a lot of work for one man, though." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Ruth found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. But before he could, the door to the bunkhouse swung open, and Frank entered, followed by several other ranch hands returning for their midday meal. The private moment was broken, and though Ruth stayed for another hour, helping serve the food that the ranch cook brought in, she and Ethan had no opportunity for further private conversation. As she prepared to leave with the Reynoldses, Ethan walked her to the buggy, moving carefully to avoid jostling his injured arm. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It meant a lot." "I'm glad you're healing well," Ruth replied, equally quietly. "When will you be back in town?" Ethan glanced at his arm. "Doc says another 2 weeks at least before I can ride, but—" He hesitated, then seemed to make up his mind about something. "Would it be all right if I called on you properly when I'm recovered, at the boarding house, I mean?" "Sunday afternoon, perhaps." Ruth's heart leapt at the formal phrasing. "Called on you properly" had only one meaning in these parts. He was asking to court her. "I'd like that very much," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Ethan's answering smile was equally radiant. 2 weeks, then? The ride back to town passed in a blur for Ruth, Mrs. Reynolds's knowing glances and gentle teasing barely registering through the haze of her happiness. Ethan wanted to court her. The feelings she had been so afraid were one-sided were in fact reciprocated. The next 2 weeks seemed interminable. Ruth threw herself into her work, sewed a new dress, the green fabric that had been part of Ethan's sister's clothes, now refashioned into a style that suited Ruth better, and tried not to count the days until Sunday. When it finally arrived, Ruth woke with the sun, too excited to sleep. She bathed carefully, using a few precious drops of the lavender toilet water that Mrs. Reynolds had given her as a thank you for extra hours worked. She arranged her hair with more attention than usual, securing it with the tortoiseshell combs that were among the few possessions she had brought from Prairie Ridge. The green dress, freshly pressed, complemented her dark hair and brought out the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Mrs. Holloway, observing these preparations with barely concealed amusement, shooed away the other boarders after the noon meal, ensuring that Ruth and Ethan would have privacy in the parlor, though with the door left conspicuously open, as propriety demanded. At precisely 2 o'clock, Ethan arrived, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and vest that Ruth had never seen before, his normally wind-blown hair slicked down with what might have been pomade. His left arm was out of the sling but still held somewhat stiffly at his side. "Miss Calloway," he greeted her formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the formality. "Thank you for receiving me, Mr. Sutton," she replied with equal formality, fighting a smile. "Please come in, Mrs." Holloway provided coffee and her best molasses cookies before retreating to the kitchen, leaving the parlor door open just enough to satisfy the demands of propriety while affording them a measure of privacy. For the first few minutes, they engaged in painfully proper small talk: the weather, the healing of Ethan's arm, the news from town. But gradually, the stiffness between them melted away, and they returned to the easy conversation that had characterized their previous interactions. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ruth ventured after a time. "About the land near the Montana border." Ethan's expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about it too, a lot." "And," Ruth prompted when he didn't continue. Ethan set down his coffee cup, seemed to gather his thoughts. "Ruth, I need to be honest with you about something, about my past." Ruth's heart stuttered with sudden apprehension, but she nodded for him to continue. "After the war I was lost," Ethan began. "Drank too much, got into fights, ended up in some trouble back east in Ohio." "Nothing violent," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just some debts I couldn't pay, some promises I didn't keep." He looked down at his hands. "I came west to start fresh, but I've always been running from that past, always afraid it would catch up to me." Ruth waited, sensing there was more. "But lately," Ethan continued, "I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop running, to build something lasting." His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "Meeting you, seeing how brave you were, walking away from everything you knew because it was the right thing for you, it made me realize that I've been hiding rather than truly starting over." The naked vulnerability in his expression made Ruth's throat tighten with emotion. "What are you saying, Ethan?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Ruth, more than I thought possible. And I'm asking if you might consider a future together, building something side by side." The words were not quite a proposal, but they held the weight of one, the promise of more to come if she was willing. Ruth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I care for you too," she said softly, "and yes, I would consider that, very much." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He reached across the small space between them to take her hand, his touch gentle yet sure. "Then I'll speak to Mrs. Holloway about calling on you regularly, and I'll work harder than ever to make that land a reality." "And I'll continue saving," Ruth added, squeezing his hand. "We'll build it together." In that moment, with the afternoon sun slanting through the parlor window and Ethan's hand warm around hers, Ruth felt the final pieces of her new life falling into place. She had found not just safety or security, but something she had never truly had in Prairie Ridge, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The months that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Ruth, a happiness so complete that she sometimes found herself holding her breath, afraid it might shatter if examined too closely. Ethan called on her every Sunday, and often managed to extend his Tuesday supply runs into brief visits as well. Their courtship progressed with a blend of traditional formality and frontier practicality. Ethan took Ruth to the town's social gatherings, a harvest dance in late October, a Christmas pageant at the school, a New Year's celebration at one of the more respectable saloons. They attended church together on Sundays, and gradually, Ruth found herself accepted as part of the Buffalo community. No longer viewed as an outsider or object of curiosity, by early spring, Ethan had saved enough to make an offer on the land he'd spoken of. It was accepted, and suddenly their future together took on a more concrete form. There would be a small cabin to build, fences to erect, cattle to purchase. Ruth continued working for the Reynoldses and at the boarding house, saving every penny she could to contribute to their shared dream. One crisp March evening, as they walked back to the boarding house after a community supper at the church, Ethan stopped at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The sky above them was a tapestry of stars, more brilliant than any Ruth had ever seen. "I'd like to show you the land next weekend," Ethan said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, "if Mrs. Holloway will allow it. Mrs. Reynolds has offered to chaperone." "I'd like that," Ruth replied, her heart quickening at the thought of seeing their future home. "Mrs. Holloway is quite fond of you now. I'm sure she'll agree." Ethan smiled, then turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Ruth, I've been trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words, but I'm realizing there's no such thing. There's just us here now." Ruth's breath caught as Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight, a ring, simple but beautifully crafted, with a small pearl set between two tiny sapphires. "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, not just a ranch, but a home. A family. Will you marry me, Ruth Calloway?" Tears sprang to Ruth's eyes, blurring the stars above them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. Their first kiss was tender, a promise sealed under the vast Wyoming sky. "It was my grandmother's," Ethan explained as Ruth admired the ring. "The only family heirloom I kept when I left Ohio, been carrying it with me ever since I knew I wanted to ask you." "It's perfect," Ruth said, and it was not ostentatious like the gaudy diamond Judge Harmon had once offered, but elegant and meaningful, like the love she and Ethan shared. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, their steps light despite the cold. Mrs. Holloway took one look at Ruth's glowing face and the ring on her finger and broke into a rare, wide smile. "About time," she declared, pulling Ruth into a brief but heartfelt embrace. "I expect you'll be wanting the wedding here then." Ruth looked at Ethan, suddenly realizing they hadn't discussed the particulars. "We haven't set a date yet," she began, "after the cabin's built," Ethan said firmly. "I want to bring my bride home to a proper house, not a tent on the prairie." "Sensible," Mrs. Holloway approved. "Early summer, then. That gives you time to build and Ruth time for a proper trousseau," and just like that it was decided. The news spread quickly through Buffalo's tight-knit community, and Ruth found herself the recipient of congratulations, advice, and offers of help from people who, less than a year ago, had been complete strangers. Mrs. Reynolds insisted on hosting a small engagement gathering, and even Dr. Reynolds unbent enough to offer a toast to the couple's happiness. The ranch owner from the Broken Spoke, Mr. Johnson, presented them with a pair of fine breeding heifers as an early wedding gift, and Mrs. Holloway quietly let it be known that she was piecing together a wedding quilt. The weekend trip to see the land was postponed due to a late spring snowstorm, but finally, in early April, Ruth, Ethan, and Mrs. Reynolds set out in the doctor's buggy to visit what would soon be the Sutton Ranch. The land was even more beautiful than Ruth had imagined, a gentle valley surrounded by rolling hills. with a creek running through it that Ethan assured her never ran dry, even in the driest summers. There was a grove of cottonwood trees that would provide shade in summer and shelter from the winter winds, and meadows that would be perfect for grazing cattle. "We'll build the cabin there," Ethan said, pointing to a spot near the cottonwoods. "Facing east, so we'll have the sunrise coming through the windows." Ruth closed her eyes, imagining it a cozy cabin with a porch where they could sit in the evenings, watching their cattle graze in the valley below. Perhaps someday children playing in the yard. "It's perfect," she said, opening her eyes to find Ethan watching her with a tender expression. "I can't wait to start our life here." The weeks that followed were a flurry of preparations. Ethan, with the help of several men from the Broken Spoke in Buffalo, began work on the cabin, riding out to the land every day and returning to town only on weekends. Ruth continued her work while also preparing for her new role as a rancher's wife, learning more about animal husbandry from Mrs. Johnson, practicing her bread making with Mrs. Holloway, and sewing not just for her trousseau but for the home they would share. As the June wedding date approached, Ruth found herself thinking often of her family in Prairie Ridge. She had written to her aunt in Denver shortly after arriving in Buffalo, letting her know she was safe, but had received no reply. She assumed her father had forbidden any contact. Her brother, last she'd heard, was working in a mine near Denver, but she had no address for him. The thought that she would marry without a single family member present brought an unexpected pang of sorrow. For all the happiness she had found in Buffalo, there was still a hollow space where her family should have been. One evening, as she and Mrs. Holloway sat stitching on the wedding quilt, Ruth finally voiced this sadness. "It's natural to miss them," Mrs. Holloway said, her usual brisk tone softened with understanding. "No matter what they did or didn't do. I keep thinking my brother, at least, would want to know," Ruth said. "We were always close before he left." Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a moment, then set down her stitching. "Why don't you write to him again? Send it to your aunt, ask her to forward it if she can. What if my father intercepts it? Then you're no worse off than before," Mrs. Holloway pointed out. "But if there's a chance your brother could be here for your wedding." The idea took root, and the next day Ruth wrote a letter to her brother Richard, care of her aunt in Denver. She kept it brief, explaining where she was, that she was to be married, and that she would dearly love to see him if possible. She sealed it with a prayer and handed it to Mr. Weeks to include in the outgoing mail. 2 weeks passed with no response, and Ruth tried to resign herself to a wedding without family. The cabin was nearly complete, a simple but solid structure with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, with space to expand as their family grew. Ethan had proudly shown her the latest progress during his weekend visit, pointing out the shelves he'd built for her books and the extra-large windows he'd installed to let in the light she loved. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in June, a time when the prairie would be in full bloom. Mrs. Holloway had finished the quilt, a beautiful pattern she called Wedding Ring, and Mrs. Reynolds had given Ruth a set of fine china that had belonged to her mother. The town's seamstress had helped Ruth fashion a wedding dress from cream-colored silk ordered specially from Cheyenne, and Ethan had a new suit being made by the same seamstress. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. And yet, as the day approached, Ruth couldn't shake the small shadow of sadness that fell across her happiness. 3 days before the wedding, Ruth was helping Mrs. Holloway prepare dinner when they heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Such arrivals usually meant trouble and accident at one of the ranches, perhaps, or news of outlaws in the area. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and followed Mrs. Holloway to the porch. A rider was dismounting in front of the boarding house, a young man in dusty clothes, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. As he looked up, Ruth's heart stopped. "Richard," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Her brother's face, thinner and more weathered than she remembered but unmistakably his, broke into a wide grin. "Hello, Ruthie." Ruth flew down the steps and into her brother's arms, tears streaming down her face as he lifted her off her feet in a bear hug. "How, and I can't believe you're here," she managed between sobs. Got your letter 2 days ago, Richard explained, setting her down but keeping an arm around her shoulders. Rode straight through. Couldn't miss my sister's wedding, could I, Mrs. Holloway, watching from the porch with suspiciously bright eyes, called out, "Bring your brother inside, Ruth. He looks like he could use a meal and a wash." Over dinner, Richard explained that he had indeed been working in the mines near Denver, but had recently taken a job as a surveyor for the railroad, which was why their aunt's letter had taken so long to reach him. He had left their father's house less than a month after Ruth, unable to stomach the man's increasing bitterness and control. "He actually tried to arrange a marriage for me too," Richard said, shaking his head in disbelief, "to the banker's daughter in Prairie Ridge. When I refused, he threatened to disown me, just like he did you." He reached across the table to squeeze Ruth's hand. "I told him he'd already lost one child through his stubbornness and I'd be damned if I let him lose another, but he wouldn't listen." "I'm sorry," Ruth said, feeling a fresh wave of grief for the family they had once been. Richard shrugged. "Don't be. Best decision I ever made leaving. Found work I enjoy, met some good people." He grinned suddenly. "Speaking of which, when do I get to meet this cowboy of yours?" "Tomorrow," Ruth promised. "He's finishing up work at the ranch tonight, but he'll be in town tomorrow to stay until after the wedding." When Ethan arrived the next day, his reaction to finding Ruth's brother at the boarding house was one of undisguised pleasure. "I'm glad to meet you," he said, shaking Richard's hand firmly. "Ruth's spoken of you often." Richard sized Ethan up with a brother's critical eye, then nodded approvingly. "Likewise, though I feel I should warn you, as the only family Ruth has here, that I'll be watching out for her happiness." "I'd expect nothing less," Ethan replied seriously, "and I promise you her happiness is my highest concern." The two men seemed to reach an understanding in that moment, and Ruth felt the last of her sadness melt away. She might not have her father to walk her down the aisle, but she would have her brother, and she would be gaining not just a husband but a future full of possibilities. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that seemed created especially for beginnings. The small church was decorated with wildflowers gathered by the Reynolds children, and it seemed that everyone in Buffalo had turned out for the occasion. Mrs. Holloway, serving as Ruth's matron of honor, helped her dress in the cream silk gown, arranged her hair with orange blossoms sent all the way from California, and placed her mother's lace veil carefully over her dark curls. "You look beautiful, child," the older woman said, her usual briskness giving way to genuine emotion. "I'm proud of you, you know, coming here alone, making your way. You're stronger than you know." Ruth embraced her, careful not to crush either of their dresses. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't taken me in that first day." "You'd have found your way," Mrs. Holloway said confidently, "but I'm glad it was my doorstep you landed on." She stepped back, adjusting the veil one last time. "Now, your brother's waiting to walk you down the aisle, and there's a very nervous young man at the altar who looks like he might wear a hole in the floor if you don't appear soon." The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Ruth, Richard's arm steady beneath her hand as he walked her down the aisle. Ethan's face, alight with love as he watched her approach, the minister's words binding them together, the simple gold bands they exchanged along with their vows. And then Ethan was lifting her veil and his kiss was sealing their promise, and the small church was erupting in cheers and well wishes. The celebration afterward, held in the town square under a canopy of bunting and lanterns, lasted well into the evening. There was food contributed by every household in Buffalo, music provided by a fiddler from one of the ranches and a pianist from the saloon, and dancing that grew increasingly energetic as the night wore on. Ruth and Ethan slipped away just as the stars were beginning to appear, boarding a wagon that would take them to their new home. Mrs. Holloway, Mrs. Reynolds, and several other women from town had gone ahead earlier in the day to prepare the cabin, stocking the pantry, making up the bed with the wedding quilt, and filling vases with wildflowers. As they approached the cabin, Ethan drew the wagon to a halt at the edge of the property. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, the new name rolling off his tongue with evident pleasure, "welcome home." Before Ruth could respond, he had jumped down from the wagon and come around to her side, lifting her into his arms in a smooth motion that made her laugh in surprise. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Ethan replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's tradition." He carried her all the way to the cabin door, which he managed to push open without setting her down, and across the threshold into their new home. The main room was warm and welcoming, with a fire burning in the stone fireplace and lanterns casting a golden glow over the simple furniture that Ethan had crafted himself. Setting her gently on her feet, Ethan kept his arms around her waist. "What do you think?" "It's not much yet," but Ruth silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as they lay together beneath the wedding quilt, Ruth's head pillowed on Ethan's chest, she thought about the journey that had brought her here from the desperate young woman walking alone on the dusty trail to the wife and future ranch mistress she was now. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About the day we met," Ruth replied. "How lost I was, how you found me." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "I think maybe we found each other," he said softly. "I was just as lost in my way. Running from my past instead of building a future." Ruth raised herself on one elbow to look into his face, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had seen her at her lowest and still believed in her strength. "Well, we're not lost anymore," she said, "and our future starts now." The years that followed were not without challenges. Building a ranch from scratch required backbreaking work, long hours, and constant vigilance against the threats of weather, disease, and occasional rustlers. The cabin gradually expanded as Ethan added rooms, first a proper kitchen, then a small parlor, and finally, in their third year of marriage, a nursery for their son, James Richard Sutton, born on a snowy December night with Mrs. Calloway serving as midwife. Ruth learned the rhythms of ranch life, how to stretch supplies during the long winters, how to treat minor injuries and illnesses when the doctor was too far away to call, how to manage the household accounts with the same careful attention Ethan gave to the breeding of their growing herd. She planted a vegetable garden that flourished under her care, kept chickens that provided eggs year-round, and even learned to shoot a rifle accurately enough to deter the occasional wolf or coyote that threatened their livestock. Richard visited whenever his work for the railroad brought him to Wyoming, and became Uncle Richard to little James and, 2 years later, to Elizabeth Ann Sutton, who arrived during a summer thunderstorm that her father swore was less fearsome than his daughter's lusty first cries. Mrs. Holloway made the journey from Buffalo for each birth, staying for a few weeks to help Ruth adjust to the new arrivals before returning to her boarding house with promises to visit again soon. The ranch, now known throughout the territory as the Double S, became a stopping point for travelers between Buffalo and the Montana border, known for its hospitality as well as the quality of its cattle. In their 5th year of marriage, Ruth received a letter that bore the Prairie Ridge postmark. Her hands trembled as she opened it, Ethan watching with concern from across the kitchen table where they sat having their morning coffee. The letter was from her father. "Dearest Ruth," it began, the formal address a shock after years of silence. "I write to you now as a dying man, seeking forgiveness for wrongs I can no longer pretend were justified." The letter went on to explain that he had been diagnosed with consumption, that the doctors gave him little time, and that his greatest regret was the estrangement from his children. He had heard of Ruth's marriage and the birth of her children from a traveler passing through Prairie Ridge, and hoped that she might find it in her heart to respond, to let him know that she was well, even if she could not forgive him. Ruth set the letter down, tears blurring her vision. Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. "What will you do?" he asked softly. Ruth considered the question carefully. The hurt her father had inflicted was deep, the years of silence a wound that had scarred over but never fully healed. And yet she thought of her own children, of the unconditional love she felt for them, and knew that she could not let her father die believing himself unforgiven. "I'll write to him," she decided, "and if there's time I'd like to visit him. With you and the children if you're willing. Ethan squeezed her hand. Whatever you want to do, I'm with you. Ruth's letter reached Prairie Ridge barely a week before her father passed away. She received the news from her aunt, who had been caring for him in his final days. He had died, she wrote, with Ruth's letter in his hand, a piece on his face that had been absent for years. The loss brought a complex mix of emotions: grief for what might have been, relief that there had been some reconciliation at the end, and a renewed appreciation for the family Ruth had created with Ethan. They held a small memorial service at the ranch, with Richard joining them to share memories of their father in better days. Life continued its steady pace. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and the Suttons became fixtures in the community that had expanded around them as more settlers moved into the territory. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, and Ruth proudly cast her ballot in the first election, Wyoming being the first state to grant women the right to vote. On a warm evening in the summer of 1895, Ruth and Ethan sat on the porch of their now substantial ranch house, watching their children: James, now 12, Elizabeth, 10, and Thomas, their youngest at 5, playing in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. "Do you ever think about that day on the trail?" Ruth asked, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. "When you found me," Ethan's arm tightened around her. "More often than you might think," he admitted. "Whenever I'm riding that stretch of road between here and Buffalo. Whenever I see something that reminds me how close I came to missing you entirely." Ruth smiled, thinking of the frightened young woman she had been, fleeing a future she couldn't accept, and the man who had seen her true worth when she doubted it herself. "You know what I remember most clearly? What you said to me: you made the right choice. No one had ever validated my decisions like that before." "Best thing I ever said," Ethan murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And the truest. You did make the right choice that day, and every day since I've been grateful for it." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Wyoming sky, Ruth Calloway Sutton looked out over the home and family. She and Ethan had built together the fulfillment of dreams neither of them had dared to hold when they first met on that dusty trail. From the moment she had refused to compromise her dignity and self-worth by marrying a man she could never respect or love, to this peaceful evening surrounded by the fruits of her courage, Ruth's path had been one of her own choosing, and in the end that had made all the difference.